Tonight's stories aren't about monsters hiding in the woods. They're about families, memories, and the terrible things we convince ourselves never happened. My name is Emily, and for most of my life, I believed my mother abandoned me. I was 11 when she disappeared. That morning looked exactly like every other school morning. She was standing in the kitchen, making coffee while I searched for a worksheet I was supposed to bring to class. I remember being annoyed because she kept reminding me not to forget it. By that evening, she was gone. Nobody found a note. Nobody got a phone call. My father sat me down at the kitchen table and told me she had left. According to him, she packed a bag while I was at school and decided she didn't want a family anymore. People accepted that explanation surprisingly fast. After a few months, nobody in town mentioned her name unless I brought it up first. Eventually, I stopped bringing it up. My father raised me alone after that. He paid the bills, showed up to school events, fixed things around the house, and did everything that looked normal from the outside. Whenever I asked about my mother, though, the answer never changed. She chose to leave us. More than 20 years passed before I found anything that made me question that story. My father died when I was 34. After the funeral, I spent several weekends cleaning out the house before putting it on the market. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect: boxes of receipts, rusted tools, old manuals for appliances we hadn't owned in years. The last room I tackled was the garage. Beneath a workbench sat a locked metal toolbox I had never seen before. I ended up cutting the lock off with a grinder. Inside were dozens of cassette tapes stacked in neat rows. Every one of them had my mother's name written across the label. The dates stopped me cold. The earliest tape had been recorded 2 weeks after she disappeared. The latest was almost 10 years later. Underneath them sat a notebook in my father's handwriting. Every page was packed with town names, postmarks, maps, and routes traced across multiple states. I remember sitting on the garage floor, turning pages for nearly an hour without understanding what I was looking at. Then I found an old cassette player in the same box and pressed play. The first thing I heard was my mother taking a shaky breath. There was a long silence before she spoke, like she was trying to work up the nerve to say what came next. Then she said my name, not once, over and over. She kept asking whoever found the recording to make sure I heard it. A few minutes later, she described driving back to our street 3 days after she vanished. She said she parked down the road sometime after midnight and watched the house through the kitchen window. My father was sitting at the table. Another man was sitting across from him. She didn't know who he was. She said she got out of the car twice and walked halfway up the driveway before turning back. The tape ended before she explained why. I listened to another one, then another. By sunrise, I had covered the garage floor with cassette cases and notebook pages. The recordings never sounded rehearsed. Some were made in motel rooms, Some sounded like they were recorded inside parked cars. Once, I could hear rain hitting the roof so loudly that it drowned out parts of her voice. Certain details kept showing up again and again. The same man appearing in different states. Photographs left outside apartments she had never told anyone about. Furniture moved inside locked rooms. What stuck with me most wasn't any of that. It was the way she talked about me. She never asked whether I missed her. She never wondered if I hated her. Several times, she said she wasn't sure whether I remembered who I was anymore. In one tape, she started crying and said she couldn't even tell whether the girl growing up in that house was still her daughter. Every time she got close to explaining what happened before she vanished, she'd stop. You could hear papers moving around. Sometimes she'd whisper something under her breath, then she'd change the subject entirely. The final tape sounded different from the rest. Her voice wasn't shaking anymore. It sounded tired, the kind of tired that settles into somebody after carrying the same fear for years. She said she'd finally figured out what happened. Then she gave me an address and immediately told me never to go there. Before ending the recording, she said something that I still hear when I'm trying to fall asleep. She said, "If you're hearing this, then you're not the person they're afraid of. You're the person they made afterward." 2 days later, I drove to the address. It led to a cemetery 3 hours away. I found the grave almost immediately. The headstone carried my full name. The birth date was mine. The death date wasn't. According to the marker, Emily died the same day my mother disappeared. A second marker stood beside it. It carried my mother's name, but no death date. The cemetery office eventually confirmed the plot had been purchased decades earlier, and that her death only existed on paperwork. Nothing had ever been buried there. I hired a private investigator after that. Several weeks later, he asked to meet me in person. He spread copies of records across a table and walked me through them one by one. Everything before age 11 looked normal. Everything after age 11 looked wrong. Forms appeared years after they were supposedly filed. Signatures changed. Entire pieces of my history seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Before we left, he said something that followed me home. Officially, the real Emily disappeared when she was 11 years old. The person sitting across from him existed because somebody spent decades building a new life on top of that disappearance. A few days later, I listened to the tapes again. During the first recording, my mother described the last morning she saw me. She mentioned dropping my red lunchbox onto the kitchen floor before leaving for work. I remember stopping the tape and staring at the wall. My lunchbox had been blue. I was absolutely certain of it. I could still picture the cartoon stickers peeling off the corners. That memory felt as solid as my own name. Later that night, I pulled every family photo album out of storage. In every single picture, I was carrying a red lunchbox, the same red lunchbox my mother described. I sat there until sunrise, turning pages back and forth, because I thought I was missing something. The blue lunchbox existed nowhere, except inside my head. These days, that bothers me more than the grave, the forged records, or the tapes. I can explain a lie. I can explain fake paperwork. I don't know how to explain a memory that never happened. Nobody in my family ever spoke much about my brother's death. They argued about everything that happened after, though I didn't understand that until my grandmother's funeral. Growing up, our house was full of rules that nobody questioned. Christmas presents stayed unopened until noon because my mother said mornings belonged to the dead. Every bedroom door had to remain open before anyone went to sleep. My father walked through the house every night, resting his hand on the back of every dining chair before turning out the lights. When I asked why, he always smiled and said he was making sure everyone was home. It sounded harmless when I was a child. Years later, after my parents were gone, and I returned to empty my grandmother's house, those habits suddenly felt less like traditions and more like evidence. The first thing I noticed was the pale rectangle on the hallway wall where a framed photograph had hung for decades. The wallpaper beneath it was untouched by sunlight, but the frame itself had vanished. My aunt caught me staring at it. While we packed dishes into boxes, she looked away almost immediately and said, "Your grandmother finally took that down after your father died." I asked what had been in the frame. She folded another towel before answering, something he couldn't stop looking at. When I joked that everyone who cared was already gone, she quietly replied, "That's exactly why I'm afraid you'll find it." She left before sunset, forgetting her handbag beside the kitchen sink. I carried it outside, expecting her to laugh at herself. But instead, she took the bag without saying a word. Before closing the car door, she looked past me toward the hallway window where the empty space on the wall was just visible from the driveway. "I hoped she'd get rid of it before you came back," she said quietly. I asked what she meant, but she only shook her head. "Some things stop hurting when you stop looking at them. Your grandmother never believed that." Then she drove away. I stood there for another minute, watching the taillights disappear, realizing she'd answered my question without actually answering it. Whatever had hung on that wall wasn't valuable enough for anyone to keep, yet nobody had been able to throw it away either. After dark, I climbed into the attic, looking for the missing photograph instead of sleeping. Most of the boxes held ordinary things: Christmas decorations, school books, faded birthday cards. At the very back, I found a family album wrapped in an old quilt. Every photograph looked familiar until I reached one that had sat on my grandmother's piano for my entire childhood. My parents stood in front of the house with my older brother between them. I almost turned the page before noticing the shadows. There were 4 stretching across the grass: my father's, my mother's, my brother's. One more child, standing close enough to belong with us, even though nobody else appeared in the picture. I searched the rest of the album. Every photograph that included my brother carried the same impossible detail: an extra child's shadow just beyond the edge of the frame. Tucked inside the back cover was a newspaper clipping with everything except the headline cut away. It read only, "Local child rescued after lake accident." The article itself had been removed with careful scissors. The next morning, I drove to the county library and found the complete newspaper on microfilm. The missing article described the accident in detail. My brother had fallen through the frozen lake. My father had gone in after him. Rescue crews found my father alive, carrying his daughter out of the water. That daughter was me. My brother's body wasn't recovered until the following morning. There was no mention of another child. It was simply called a tragic accident. The photograph beside the article unsettled me far more than the words. My father sat wrapped in a blanket, outside an ambulance with his face buried in his hands. My mother wasn't looking toward the lake. She wasn't looking at my father either. She was staring at me with an expression I couldn't name. It wasn't relief. It wasn't grief. It looked like someone desperately trying to recognize a familiar face and failing. On my way home, I stopped at the bakery my mother used to visit every Thursday. The woman behind the counter remembered my family immediately. When I asked whether she'd known me as a child, she hesitated before saying, "Your grandmother usually did the shopping after the accident." I told her I remembered coming there with my mother when I was little. She shook her head gently. "No, sweetheart. Your mother stopped bringing you into town after your brother died. She hardly brought herself into town. She wasn't trying to frighten me. She was remembering something sad." I drove back to the house with the clipping in my pocket, the photograph in my bag, and one question I couldn't escape. If my family had spent 30 years pretending nothing had happened after the accident, what had frightened them so much that they erased one photograph from the wall and left every bedroom door open every night afterward? The answer was waiting in the wardrobe. My grandmother had never let anyone touch. Behind a false wooden panel lay the missing frame wrapped in an old pillowcase. The glass had been removed years earlier, but the photograph inside was still intact. My parents stood in front of the house. My brother stood beside them. Next to him was another child wearing the same sweater I remembered from my own kindergarten pictures. Someone had taken a knife and carefully scraped away the child's face until only white paper remained. The body was untouched. The hands, the clothes, even the ribbon tied around the child's wrist had been left exactly as they were. Only the face had disappeared. Folded behind the photograph was the second half of the newspaper article my grandmother had cut away. A sentence had been underlined so heavily the paper was beginning to tear. The surviving child was treated for hypothermia and severe memory loss. Underneath, in my grandmother's handwriting, was a note that read, "Memory leaves long before guilt does." I was still staring at those words when I heard the front door open. My aunt didn't ask what I'd found. She saw the photograph lying on the table and quietly sat across from me. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the only question that mattered: whose face was removed? She closed her eyes. "Yours." I thought she was mistaken. I even laughed because it was easier than accepting what I'd heard. My aunt reached into the frame and turned the photograph over. My grandmother had written 4 names across the back: my parents, my brother, then my own. She touched the last name with her finger. Your grandmother scraped the face away after your mother died. I asked why. My aunt looked toward the hallway where the empty space had been for so many years because she wanted to destroy a question, not a person. She explained it slowly, stopping whenever her voice threatened to give out. My father never believed anything except the official story. He went into the lake, came out carrying his daughter, and lost his son. That was the truth he lived with until the day he died. My mother wanted to believe it too. For months, she tried. Then small things began happening. I forgot words I had always used. I stopped recognizing places we'd visited every summer. Foods I used to beg for suddenly made me sick. Doctors said severe trauma could change a child. They said memory loss, personality shifts, even strange behavior were common after near drowning. My father accepted every explanation because he needed to. My mother accepted none of them because she couldn't silence one unbearable thought. She became convinced the little girl who came home wasn't the one who had fallen through the ice. She never told the town. She barely admitted it to herself. She simply spent the rest of her life trying to love me harder than she trusted her own mind. I didn't argue with my aunt because there was nothing to argue against. She wasn't asking me to believe my mother's fear. She was asking me to understand what that fear had done to my family. My father counted chairs every night because he could never stop counting the people he'd failed to bring home. My grandmother labeled every photograph because she was terrified memory could betray her the way grief already had. My mother stopped taking me into town because every familiar face reminded her that she no longer trusted the one living inside her own house. The open bedroom doors were never about ghosts. After the accident, my father couldn't bear another closed door because the last one he'd reached had been a sheet of ice he couldn't break quickly enough. Before leaving the house the following morning, I carried the restored photograph back into the hallway and hung it where it had always belonged. The pale rectangle disappeared beneath the frame as though the wall had been waiting for it. All those years, I stood there for a long time, looking at the blank place where my face should have been. My grandmother hadn't erased it because she believed I wasn't her granddaughter. She erased it because she refused to leave behind the question that had poisoned everyone she loved. I still don't know whether my mother was right or whether grief slowly dismantled her until she couldn't recognize her own child anymore. What frightens me isn't that I'll never know the answer. It's that every time I see an old family photograph now, I find myself looking at my own face first, wondering how many years it takes before doubt becomes another family heirloom. Claire always carried the address book with her. Nobody in the family knew why. It was a small black book with cracked corners and yellowed pages that felt as though they might tear if you turned them too quickly. When she died at 93, it ended up in a box of things nobody wanted. I brought it home because throwing it away felt worse than keeping it. Most of the pages were filled with names, addresses, birthdays, and little notes squeezed into the margins. Some names had been crossed out, others covered half a page. One name appeared more than any other: Margaret Voss. My grandmother had copied different addresses beside it, Over the years, there were reminders about birthdays, notes about presents, even a list of foods she liked. I asked my mother whether she'd ever heard of Margaret Voss. She hadn't. My aunt hadn't either. Neither had any of the older relatives I called over the next few days. A week later, I opened the address book again. The addresses were still there. The reminders were still there. Margaret Voss wasn't. I thought I'd remembered it wrong until I found a photograph I'd taken of the page the night before. Her name was sitting exactly where I remembered it. I looked back at the book on my table. The space was empty. After that, I started photographing every page before I put the book away. It didn't stop with Margaret. A few weeks later, another name disappeared. Then another. The photographs never changed. The book always did. Nobody I asked remembered those people anymore. I started looking for them anywhere I thought a name might survive. School yearbooks, property records, old newspapers on microfilm, church bulletins that smelled like dust every time I opened them. Most evenings ended the same way, with me driving home, carrying nothing except another dead end. The few things I did find never seemed to stay useful for long. Writing faded from the backs of photographs. Articles I knew I'd bookmarked were gone when I came back for them. Before long, I had a habit I never mentioned to anyone. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, walk into the spare room, and check that the address book was still sitting on the shelf. It wasn't theft I worried about. I kept expecting to open it one morning and find there had never been anything written inside at all. By then, I was back at my grandmother's house almost every weekend. I'd gone through the obvious places more than once: filing cabinets, kitchen drawers, the desk beside her bed. Every time I found another missing name, I'd think of somewhere else she might have hidden an explanation. The attic was the only part of the house I still hadn't searched properly. I wasn't looking for a notebook. I was trying to find the box of Christmas decorations when I noticed a stack of old account books tied together with string. One of them wasn't an account book at all. The first few pages were ordinary enough: shopping lists, doctor appointments, utility bills copied down for no reason I could work out. Then the names started appearing. Every page was about somebody from the address book. My grandmother wasn't writing down biographies. She was trying to hold on to the little things that disappear first. One person hated mushrooms. Another always arrived early to family dinners. Someone else laughed so hard they snorted whenever they couldn't catch their breath. Every few pages, she wrote the same 2 words: still holding. I didn't understand them until I reached the first name she'd crossed out in the address book. Beside it, she had written, "Couldn't hold anymore." I turned back through the notebook after that and realized she wasn't keeping a journal. She was leaving herself reminders of people she was afraid the world might forget. For almost a week, the notebook stayed exactly as I'd left it. I stopped expecting the next page to explain everything. The address book sat on the shelf in the spare bedroom, and some days I managed not to look at it until I was getting ready for bed. Then, one Sunday afternoon, I opened it again and found a name that hadn't been there before. It belonged to a coworker I'd had lunch with the day before. A few days later, my cousin Rachel appeared on another page. That Sunday, my uncle asked whether Rachel would be bringing dessert for dinner, then stopped because he couldn't remember her husband's name. My aunt looked at him, ready to answer, but nothing came out. After a long silence, she laughed and blamed it on getting older. Nobody else laughed. Before dinner was over, they were arguing about whether Rachel had even been at Christmas the year before. I drove home without finishing my meal because I couldn't stop thinking about the address book. That night, I noticed a section of pages near the front cover had been glued together so carefully, I almost missed them. There was one photograph underneath. Beside it lay a folded birth certificate. Neither belonged to me. The girl in the photograph looked familiar in the way strangers sometimes do, as though I'd known her once and forgotten where. The birth certificate carried a different name, different parents, and the same birthday as mine. Folded behind it was a note in my grandmother's handwriting. I couldn't keep her. I tried for years. When she started fading, I made another place for her to go. I checked the compartment again because I couldn't believe she'd hidden only a single note. There wasn't another page tucked behind it. There wasn't a diary explaining what she'd meant or who the girl was supposed to be. I spent the rest of the night at my kitchen table with tax returns, school records, and medical forms spread out around me, lining up dates against a birth certificate that shouldn't have existed. Somewhere before sunrise, I stopped trying to prove the note wrong. I was looking for one piece of paper that showed I'd been here before my grandmother decided somebody else needed my place. I called my mother that afternoon. I never mentioned the address book or the photograph. I asked about a holiday we'd taken when I was 7. She used to tell that story every Christmas, and I could still remember the way she always began it. The line went quiet, except for a faint clicking sound somewhere in the background. Then she asked what trip I meant. I started filling in the details. Halfway through, she stopped me and asked who I was. She sounded exactly the way people do when they've answered a call from a number they don't recognize and are trying not to be rude. I ended the call before she spoke again. When I came back into the room, the address book was still lying where I'd left it. Every page was blank. The names were gone. The notes were gone. Even the pages that had once been covered with crossed-out entries looked untouched. I reached for the birth certificate, but it had disappeared too. The photograph was still there. The bench wasn't empty anymore because someone had been removed from it. 3 days have passed since then. Some records still exist, others don't. Yesterday, I found my high school yearbook. The space where my senior photograph should have been was empty. The address book is beside me while I write this. I still open it a few times every day, even though nothing has changed. This morning, I had to look up my mother's phone number because I couldn't remember it. I've known that number for 20 years. There's a photograph of her on my desk. I remember taking it. I know it's my mother. If I turn it face down for a few minutes, though, I find myself struggling to remember what she looked like before I picked it up. My name is Hannah. And for most of my life, my grandmother couldn't seem to remember who I was. Not all the time. Most days, she knew exactly who I was. Then, every now and then, she'd look up from her chair, smile like she'd just seen an old friend, and call me Lucy. It happened often enough that everybody in the family had a joke about it. My grandmother moved in with us after my grandfather died, and by then people were already blaming age for everything, forgetting names, repeating stories, asking the same question twice. The Lucy thing got tossed into the same pile. Whenever I corrected her, she'd look embarrassed and apologize. My mother always said Lucy was probably some friend from childhood. Nobody thought much of it. Neither did I. A few weeks after my grandmother died, I was helping clean out her room when I found a loose floorboard beneath an old wardrobe. There was a wooden box hidden underneath. Inside were stacks of photographs, bundles of letters tied together with string, and a journal with a cracked leather cover. The photos caught my attention first. Every picture of my grandmother, as a teenager, seemed to include the same girl. They were at birthday parties together, school dances, family cookouts. One picture showed them asleep on a blanket in somebody's backyard. Another showed them standing shoulder to shoulder in matching dresses. On the back of several photos, my grandmother had written the same name, Lucy. I carried a handful of them downstairs and showed them to my mother. The second she looked at them, something changed in her face. Then she told me she'd never seen that girl before in her life. That should have been impossible. The more I looked through the box, the stranger it felt. Lucy wasn't some background friend who happened to show up a few times. She was everywhere. There were photographs where she looked more like family than a friend, yet nobody recognized her. Not my mother, not my great aunt, not a single relative still alive. One evening, I spread the pictures across my dining room table and just stared at them for hours. I remember getting hung up on one photograph in particular. Lucy had her arm around my grandmother, and both of them were laughing at something outside the frame. They looked close enough to finish each other's sentences. I couldn't stop thinking about how weird it was that an entire family could forget somebody who had clearly been standing in the middle of their lives. The journal changed everything. It started out normal enough. School gossip, complaints about teachers, arguments with her parents. Then something shifted. The handwriting got messier. Whole pages looked rushed, like she'd been writing as fast as she could. My grandmother kept coming back to Lucy. She wrote that Lucy had started getting upset because people were forgetting things, not major things at first. A conversation from the day before, plans they'd made together, memories both of them swore had happened. Then it got worse. One teacher apparently marked Lucy absent for an entire month, despite having spoken to her every day. A neighbor who'd known her since childhood suddenly introduced himself like they were strangers. One entry describes Lucy showing up at my grandmother's house, crying because her own aunt couldn't remember her birthday. Reading it now still makes my skin crawl because none of it sounds dramatic. On the page, it sounds confused, like two teenagers trying to explain something that shouldn't be happening. final entries were written only days apart. My grandmother wrote about sitting beside Lucy at a lake outside town. Lucy apparently believed people weren't forgetting memories anymore. They were forgetting her. She told my grandmother that eventually nobody would remember she had ever existed. My grandmother argued with her for 3 pages. You can actually feel the desperation in the writing. Then the entries stop. Lucy's name disappears completely. After that, the journal becomes ordinary again, almost like somebody had ripped an entire person out of the story. I spent months trying to prove she was real. Most searches went nowhere. Then I found a census record, just one. It listed Lucy living with her parents and siblings. 10 years later, another census showed the same family at the same address, same parents, same children, except Lucy was gone. There wasn't a death certificate. There wasn't a missing persons report. There wasn't anything. About a year later, I drove to the lake. I wasn't expecting answers anymore. I think I just wanted to stand where they had been standing. While walking along the shoreline, I found a small metal locket tangled beneath the roots of a fallen tree. Inside were 2 photographs. One was my grandmother as a teenager. The other was Lucy. Folded behind them was a tiny note. The paper was yellow and brittle, but the handwriting matched the journal exactly. It said, "If you're reading this, she finally forgot me too." I sat there staring at those words for a long time. What bothers me isn't finding the note. It's what happened afterward. When I got home, I showed the locket to my mother. She looked directly at Lucy's photograph for nearly a minute. Then she handed it back and asked who the girl was. The thing is, my mother had spent almost a year helping me search for Lucy. She had looked through those photographs dozens of times. We had entire conversations about her. Yet standing in my kitchen, she genuinely looked at that face as though she'd never seen it before. My birthday isn't for another 11 months, and I already catch myself looking at the empty space on my bookshelf. Every time I walk past it, there's nothing there now, just enough room for one cassette tape in a clear plastic case. I know how ridiculous that sounds. I'm 28 years old. I haven't celebrated my birthday properly since my mother died, and I don't even own much that can still play cassette tapes. But every year of my life, one arrived without fail. I didn't think there was anything strange about that until last winter. I thought I understood where they came from. I thought I understood who my father was. I thought I understood why my mother cried every birthday before she handed me another tape. It turns out I was wrong about almost everything. My father died when I was 6. Or at least that's what I'd believed my whole life. Every birthday after that, my mother gave me a cassette tape and told me he'd recorded them before the accident because he didn't want me growing up without hearing his voice. It became our routine. She'd make pancakes. I'd open whatever presents she'd managed to afford that year. Then she'd disappear into her bedroom for a minute. When she came back, there would be another cassette with my age written across the front in black marker. I never questioned it. Why would I? The voice on those tapes matched the old home videos perfectly. Some years, he'd tell stories about things I'd done when I was little. Other years, he'd make fun of relatives or joke about the kind of mistakes he hoped I'd never repeat. They never sounded rehearsed. They sounded like a father talking to his child. My mother always listened beside me without interrupting. When the tape finished, she'd smile, put it back in its case, and tell me it belonged with the others. She died last winter. After the funeral, I went back to the house to sort through everything because there wasn't anyone else left to do it. I was looking for insurance papers, tax documents, and the deed to the house, nothing more. At the back of an old filing cabinet, I found a hospital folder with my father's name on it. I almost put it back unopened until I noticed the admission date. It was the day of the accident. I sat on the bedroom floor and read every page twice because I thought I'd misunderstood something. The doctors had written the same thing over and over. My father survived the crash for 3 days, but he never regained consciousness. Nurse after nurse recorded his condition every few hours. There wasn't a single note saying he'd spoken. There wasn't a single moment when he could have spent hours recording birthday messages. I drove home, telling myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe he'd recorded them years before the accident. Maybe my mother had simply explained it badly when I was too young to understand. That idea lasted until I started listening to the tapes again. The tape marked 13 ended with my father laughing about the stray orange cat that refused to leave our backyard. We didn't move into that house until nearly 4 years after he died. The tape for my 18th birthday mentioned my mother finally buying the blue hatchback she'd wanted for years. I remembered going with her to the dealership because she cried the whole drive home, saying she wished my father had been there to see it. I spent the next week checking every story against dates I knew were real. Every time I proved one impossible, another became harder to explain. Eventually, I stopped asking how the tapes had been recorded and started asking why my mother had spent more than 20 years pretending they were from him. I worked ordinary questions into conversations with relatives without mentioning the tapes. Most answers matched my memories. Until I called my uncle, I asked if my father had ever joked about his driving. He smiled for a second before it disappeared. Then he quietly said, "Your dad never met me." I reminded him he'd married my mother's sister years before I was born. He shook his head. "No, I met your mother after the accident. Your father had already been dead for almost 2 years." I ended the call without saying goodbye. The last place I searched was my mother's wardrobe. Hidden behind a stack of blankets was a shoebox full of notebooks. At first, they looked like ordinary journals, but every entry was dated on my birthday. She wasn't writing about me. She was writing about the tape she'd given me that year. The early entries were hopeful. "Still sounds exactly like him." A few years later, they changed. Today's tape remembered the neighbor's dog. We didn't have that dog until years after Daniel died, then another. He keeps talking about people he never met. I turned to the final notebook with my hands shaking. The last entry had been written only a month before she died. It read, "I stopped believing these were recordings years ago. I still don't know who they're for anymore. I only know they stopped sounding like my husband and started sounding like the father our child needed." I packed the notebooks away because I didn't know what else to do. Whatever my mother had believed, I told myself it ended with her. That lasted until my next birthday. I hadn't told anyone the date. I wasn't speaking to much of the family anymore, and nobody knew where I'd moved. When I got home from work, a padded envelope was leaning against my apartment door. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a cassette in the same kind of clear plastic case my mother had always used. Across the front, in black marker, was a single number, 28. I still owned an old cassette player because I could never bring myself to throw the others away. I sat staring at it for almost an hour before pressing play. My father's voice came through the speaker exactly as I remembered it, only older somehow. He wished me a happy birthday, laughed about how I'd probably spent too much money fixing the leak under my kitchen sink, then said, "If you're wondering who left this outside your door, stop. You won't find an answer that makes more sense than the question." I paused the tape and walked into the kitchen. 2 nights earlier, I'd spent 3 hours underneath that sink after a pipe burst. Nobody else knew about it. When I finally finished listening, the last thing he said was, "Don't throw these away. One day, you'll need to remember me better than I ever remembered myself." I still don't know whether my mother spent her life protecting me from something impossible, or whether grief slowly convinced her that a dead man could keep growing older. I only know the space on my bookshelf is empty again, exactly wide enough for one more cassette. And every time I walk past it, I catch myself wondering if next year's tape has already been recorded. The disposable cameras weren't what caught my attention. It was the envelopes. I found them while helping clear out my aunt's garage last fall. There must have been 30 or 40 of them, stuffed inside a cardboard box. Most held photographs from my childhood, birthday parties, school plays, Christmas mornings. Then I found a stack from the Friday trips my father used to take me on. Those were my favorite memories growing up. Every Friday, he'd leave work early, pick me up, and drive somewhere new. A lake, a diner, a hiking trail. Sometimes, we'd end up in another county before sunset. Looking through the pictures felt like flipping through the happiest parts of my life, until I noticed every roll of film had been developed by the same photo lab near our hometown. That didn't make sense. Some of those photos were taken more than 100 miles away. I brought the envelopes to my aunt, thinking she'd laugh at the mistake. Instead, she got quiet. After a while, she asked whether I remembered the drive home from those trips. I told her I usually fell asleep in the truck. She nodded and asked if I remembered ever arriving home. I sat there staring at her because I honestly didn't know. The question followed me home. I started pulling out old photo albums and calendars, trying to figure out why she'd reacted that way. That's when I noticed something else. There were hundreds of photographs, From those Fridays, not one showed me returning home. Not one showed my mother. Not one showed my older brother. The pictures always ended the same way, me smiling beside my father, somewhere far from town. The next image would be breakfast the following morning. It felt ridiculous to obsess over something that small, but once I noticed it, I couldn't stop. I called my aunt a few days later and asked what she'd meant. She avoided the question completely. Then she said something that made me even more uncomfortable. She told me my father never missed a Friday, not once. Rain, snow, sickness, overtime shifts, it didn't matter. He always took me somewhere. Before hanging up, she said she hoped I would leave it alone. That was the first moment I became certain there was something to find. The deeper I dug, the stranger those years looked. Old family calendars had strange marks on certain Fridays. My mother's journals mentioned doctor's appointments, but never said who they were for. One entry described my father coming home with a black eye. Another talked about replacing a bedroom door. There were dozens of little details that seemed meaningless by themselves. Together, they felt like fragments of a story nobody wanted to tell. I eventually requested copies of some childhood medical records. Most were normal. One wasn't. When I was 9, a doctor had documented recurring sleep disturbances and anxiety. The notes mentioned household stressors. The page after that was missing entirely. Not redacted. Missing. Around the same time, I found an old photograph I'd never seen before. My father was standing in our driveway, loading sleeping bags into his truck. In the background, barely visible through a window, my mother was holding someone back. The image was blurry, but I knew exactly who it was. My brother. I drove to my aunt's house the next morning and put the photograph in front of her. Her eyes stayed on it longer than I expected. Then she pushed it back across the table and said she didn't want to be the person who told me certain things. I asked whether the trips had something to do with my brother. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked what I actually remembered about him. The question caught me off guard, because the answer was almost nothing. I could remember birthdays, Christmases, a handful of ordinary moments. My brother had lived in the same house for 16 years, yet somehow my memories of him felt thinner than memories of classmates I hadn't seen in decades. My aunt looked exhausted. Eventually, she said there were years when my parents barely slept. She said my father never took me on those trips because he wanted adventures. He took me because it was the only place he believed I was safe. Then she stopped talking. No matter what I asked after that, she wouldn't say another word. Most of the records led nowhere after that. A month later, I was sorting through boxes from my mother's old sewing room when I found a thick recipe binder held together with cracked rubber bands. Half the pages were handwritten recipes. The rest looked like things she'd tucked away simply because she didn't know where else to put them. Appliance warranties, insurance forms, receipts from stores that no longer existed. Buried between two stained recipe cards was a folded photocopy from a child psychologist's office. The first page was gone. Large sections had been blacked out with marker. Most of it was unreadable. One sentence wasn't. The evaluator recommended immediate separation from a younger family member due to escalating risk. I sat on the floor, staring at those words for a long time. Suddenly, everything fit. The locks on my bedroom door, my father carrying me inside every Friday instead of waking me up, the way my mother always seemed tense whenever my brother entered a room. I realized something else too. The reason I couldn't remember arriving home wasn't because I always slept through the drive. My father never brought me back until long after my brother was asleep. By the time I woke up, I was already in bed. The trips had never been vacations, they had been waiting rooms. I visit my father's grave most Fridays now. I still tell him about work. I still tell him about my life. Some habits are hard to lose. For a long time, I thought the hardest part of this story was learning that my childhood wasn't what I believed. It isn't. The hardest part is realizing how much effort went into protecting a version of me that never knew there was anything to be protected from. I still don't know everything that happened in that house. Some records are gone. Some people refuse to talk. Maybe that's for the best. What stays with me isn't the missing information. It's a memory I used to love without understanding. Every Friday evening, my father would glance at me in the passenger seat to make sure I was asleep before turning the truck around and heading home. For most of my life, I thought that look was the expression of a happy father enjoying time with his daughter. Now I think it was something else entirely. I think it was the look of a man checking to make sure a rescue mission had worked one more time.